So just in the last 90 minutes on my news feed, there's been a Time article where George's boss has said we can make it back to the moon in 2 years. There's been a National Geographic article that, again, is remarking upon an event that happened 50 years ago, right? And it's not just talking about the moon, it's talking about the moons of our solar system. And again, I think those perspectives are a really interesting opportunity that we have to consider. Because plus or minus about 4 hours, 50 years ago today, that happened. That simple image that's in front of you, right? A simple imprint, it happened. And I think it's an important thing to put into context now 50 years since. Since 1969, when there was that small step for a man and a giant leap for humankind. I think those are important things to keep in mind in terms of not only aspects of the policy that got us there. I think it's important to remember the competition that got us there. I think it's important to remember the engineering challenges that are there, and then the opportunities that are before us as well. Because it's easy to think of Ryan Gosling, stepping out of the Eagle lander, right, or Neil Armstrong, depending on one's perspective. But at the same point in time, it was just 2 years prior to that in Apollo 1, which was met with abject tragedy, that there was a fire on board a capsule. But it's important, I think, to look at how, again, out of tragedy, learning and understanding comes about. And you can think about that from an engineering perspective. You can think about, again, just the danger and the difficulty of such endeavors as they go forth. So we'll get started here with the distinguished panel, again, of Tillman Scholars. Drew Garza, working just with a recent award of a space policy degree, works with NASA directly. Josh Pericles, coming out of the University of South Florida, a number of opportunities that he's had to expand to that his own knowledge and application of that. And then George Sondecker, who's also with Spacex. Now, before we get started, a couple of ground rules, particularly in some of the questions coming in. One, we're going to start with the basic presumption that the facts that we actually did go to the moon are in fact facts. So we won't really get into some of the conspiracy theories, regardless of the pristine nature of the lighting and some of the images, right? Two, we're not going to use the Slido app to try to organize our own assault on Area 51. In terms of where that goes. But I think it besets a very, very interesting context in which to look at how education, interest, personal and professional growth can apply to some of the challenges of where we move forward in terms of space, engineering, and government commercial interaction along those lines. So keeping that in mind, and particularly this notion of like your education, your interests, some of the things that you're specifically focused on, and how you've grown personally and professionally with this huge idea of, space policy. In your case, Drew, if you could just share with us some of your initial thoughts, where that sort of started for you, and something we should consider, right, in terms of what it means to, again, quote from President Reagan, slip the surly bonds of Earth, right, as we look out into the atmosphere and all the promise that could deliver.
Sure. So, well, first, I'd like to thank you for recognizing the milestone that we're celebrating today. I like to think that the Pat Tillman Foundation just loves space so much that they purposely scheduled something for this weekend years ago. So either way, it's a very apt and fitting coincidence. If I could tell a quick story about Buzz Aldrin, who I think, that's him. Buzz, yeah. So I was at the Humans to Mars Summit, 2016, I think. I was volunteering there actually, and they were having a panel on the best mission architecture to take us to Mars. Buzz had spoken earlier. He was there, and if you're not familiar with Buzz Aldrin, he's a very, very overwhelming personality. He's extremely passionate about human spaceflight. If you've seen the video where he punched a guy that challenged him on the validity of Buzz is Buzz, to say the least. So yeah, the panel had just wrapped up, and we had the audience questions or the mics in the aisles for questions. Buzz actually comes up to the mic, challenges one of the panelists. The panelist challenges back, and Buzz says, well, let me show you what I'm talking about. And he already had his slides queued up and ended up giving like a 30-minute presentation from the audience question mic. So Slido does have its advantages. I'm sure Buzz still would have found a way, but
just no Area 51 assault
yes,
planning.
There you go. So yes, I just graduated with my master's in space policy from the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. I've been exploring, various aspects of the space policy world over the course of my 2 years at the institute. I do work for NASA. I'm a program manager at headquarters, so I manage one of their peer review programs. So believe it or not, I actually do more space policy stuff in school than I do at NASA. But just over the course of this past year, I was on the research team for the Space Security Index, which is an annual publication that gets used across the space policy world. It examines various indicators of space sustainability and space security. The research was actually presented at the UN conference for the peaceful use of outer space in Vienna, Austria in June. Not by me, I wish. It was our senior researcher that went out and did that. And I've also been involved with a few think tanks providing policy analysis on various aspects of space security. One of them I touched on yesterday at the unconference talk. It's a very rapidly emerging field across many different sectors with the emergence of commercial space, and policy is just as any other emerging field. Policy has to struggle to catch up. There's a lot of regulatory burdens that are in place. Some with good intentions. Some that are, just hindering progress, and it's a very complicated and widespread field that touches on a lot of other different support fields like economics, law, obviously on the technical side, engineering, and it's something that needs to be tackled sooner rather than later, especially in the case of space sustainability, which I'm going to get to here in a second. And you'll see why. It's a very hot topic in space policy, and hopefully it's something that not only myself but my colleagues and maybe even some of you guys can help address in the future. So,
Josh,
is this the intro?
It is the intro.
Okay.
Yeah.
This light's giving me a headache. Sorry. I'm an undergrad computer engineering major. I applied for a Pathways co-op program with NASA in 2017. I was lucky enough to get picked up. So within that, I work at Kennedy Space Center about every 2 semesters, and I'm at the Commercial Crew program. If you're not familiar with Commercial Crew, it's we ended the shuttle program, and the push to get astronauts back to the ISS with American-built equipment was what is kind of the thought process behind Commercial Crew. But with that, it was, hey, we've kind of perfected human spaceflight in low Earth orbit from a NASA standpoint. If you look at shuttle, 7 astronauts capability, it's got its own habitat. It can do things on orbit for several weeks, or it could dock with the space station. So the idea was, let's foster a commercial industry and kind of bring these companies on board with human spaceflight. So in that office, I work with a bunch of brilliant people who outclass me every meeting I go to, which is always fun. But it's been a real learning curve, and just kind of learning about human spaceflight and the difference between flying cargo payloads and flying human payloads, and just the work it takes to perform safely in space. So it's about it. I mean, I can ramble on more if you guys want.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll get to some questions on that soon. And then, George, how do you get from military service to SpaceX?
Well, one day at a time. But first of all, I'm George. Favorite karaoke song, Starman by David Bowie. So I'll see y'all tonight. Been practicing. I cut my teeth originally with space at the Air Force Academy. They have a small satellite program there. Got to break a lot of hardware and not be held too accountable for it. Very patient instructors. So patient that they sent me on to grad school for a couple years, where I got to teach people how to break hardware, space hardware, and occasionally fly it. And from there, was sent out to the Air Force's Space and Missile Systems Center. That's the Air Force's big acquisition center out in Los Angeles, California. So real hardship tour there as a second lieutenant. And there it was not okay to break hardware. These were big government systems. But fortunately, I had the opportunity to work on a little small satellite project, CubeSats. Have you guys heard of these little things? They're like little loaf of bread sized satellites that are capable of doing some pretty awesome things. And I think these also may keep Drew up at night. But we'll talk about the congestion in space of these little satellites. Launched a few of those and saw what was happening in the commercial industry and decided to make a little bit of a change. Went to business school for a couple years. Pat Tillman Foundation helped me out a little bit there. And started to work at Spacex. So in summer of 2015, I was an intern out there and turned into a full-time offer and have been there ever since. And today I'm a mission manager working in Hawthorne, California for Spacex.
Very, very cool. Now, two of you have already mentioned, actually three of you have alluded to just the insane difficulty and the challenges associated with space flight, be it either low Earth orbit or going beyond some of those thresholds that are there in terms of be it either consciously placed items or other items that are there. Again, Drew, one of the things that you mentioned was space debris. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So, I'm like Buzz, right?
Yeah.
So orbital debris and space sustainability. So space sustainability has really been my wheelhouse for the past year. It's a very broad term. It covers not only the safe and clear operation in different orbital paths in space, but also general security, situational awareness in space. The cost of access to space, it covers a lot. It's basically the intent to make space and keep space accessible and safe to operate in. But orbital debris is a significant challenge and threat to space sustainability and space operations, and we'll go into a little bit of why. But let's talk about exactly what orbital debris is. So aside from operating satellites that are on orbit, dead satellites are still up there. They don't necessarily always come down. In fact, they rarely come down on their own. Rocket bodies, fairings, the covers that cover the payload as they blow off in orbit, they stay up there. Some of them come down, but a lot of them stay up there. From operational missions, screws, tools, one each glove astronaut. There was actually an astronaut glove that floated away on one mission. That's an Army supply joke for your Army guys. But mostly it's fragments. The fragmentation events, collisions, the residual pieces of metal and hardware that pop off where there's a small explosive event to release a payload back when they used to do that. All of that creates debris. It's inherent to human space operations. It's all entirely human created, and it's in almost every it is in every operational orbit above the Earth. So some statistics: since Sputnik was launched in 1957, there's been about 5,450 rocket launches, excluding surface failures. About 5,500 launches that actually made it up to space or somewhere close. All of those launches put close to 9,000 satellites in orbit in some form or fashion. 5,000 of those satellites are still in space. A little under 2,000 are still functioning. Of all of the debris objects that are currently in orbit, we can track about 22,000 of them. There's been more than 500 fragmentation events. Again, fragmentation events can be collisions, it can be normal space operations, There's been a recent increase in debris that comes from either residual fuel that's left in propellant tanks that end up exploding on their own over the course of time, or outgassing. So when you create materials here on Earth, even solids have microscopic pockets of atmosphere, basically, within their structure. So as they spend time in orbit, those little pockets tend to try to make their way out into the vacuum of space, and you have material blowouts. It's basically like popping a metal pimple. There'll be a
It's a wonderful visual
Thank
image.
you.
Thank you.
I worked, yeah.
Thank you.
I toyed a lot with it, and I figured that was the best one to explain, give you the visualization. But yeah, it creates lots of small fragment pieces. All in all, total mass of all the space objects in Earth orbit is more than 8,400 tons. These statistics are from the European Space Agency, so I don't know if that's metric tons or, I don't know. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Royale with cheese. But what I want to bring your attention to is the bottom left corner. So 34,000 objects are in orbit above 10 centimeters, close to 1 million between 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters, and 128 million objects between 1 millimeter and 1 centimeter. And again, of all of those numbers, we're only tracking 22,300. They're all flying around up there at about 17,500 miles per hour. The speed of impact, of course, is relative to how you're approaching it, or what the angles of intersection are. But I mean, even a small fragment, it's the force of a 50 cal bullet, maybe even worse. So they can disable satellite components. They could potentially disable satellites completely. So this is a graph that I like to show because to me it shows the inherent creation of space debris around human spaceflight and space operations. This is the increase of space debris over the course of space history since 1960. You can see the different colors are basically different types of debris, be it rocket bodies, rocket debris, payload, whatever. But you can see the ratios of those colors kind of stay the same as we're moving across the graph. Meaning that no matter what we've really tried, we're still every operational launch that puts something into space is still creating that debris. If I can bring your attention to the green part of the bar, right around 2009, you can see there's a significant increase there. That is from a single satellite collision. So 2 satellites collided, created a sizable field of debris, and you can see how much of an increase there was in space debris just from one collision. And then also the brown part that's on the top of unidentified objects is mainly a testament to the improvement of our tracking capability. So we've been able to see more and more things as technology has improved, but now we're starting to get into the realm where we're starting to see things and we don't know where they came from. Everything else previously has been tracked since launch. So we know we're watching it all the way up. We see when the rocket bodies or whatever separate, and we can see the pieces. The unidentified parts are basically stuff we didn't catch, and now we can see. So this next slide is going to have a video. I'll just let you look at it while I talk through some statistics, but it's basically going to show you the proliferation of space debris according to size and over time. Going back to what we can track, so ground-based telescopes can detect debris down to about 10 centimeters in geo, a few centimeters in size, around between 1 to 5, depending on their orientation, in low Earth orbit. On-site impact detectors, so the impact detectors and the sensors that are actually like on the space station or on some spacecraft, can obviously see stuff that's significantly smaller, but that's really only in the area immediately around the spacecraft or the space station or in its orbital path. So while it does find stuff, it doesn't really help us with aggregate tracking on the surface. So obviously those dots are not to scale. I mean, those would all be like small cities that are floating up there. It's not as packed as it looks, but there is still there's a lot up there, and there's a lot of danger to normal operations if we don't get it if we don't get it cleaned up.
Now, I'm sort of interested because earlier when you were talking about some of the implications of policy, right, is you, in some ways, and correct me if I'm wrong, but described policy is not necessarily a rapid changing piece.
Right.
But yet, in terms of one collision, just on the graph you just sort of showed, you have this, an order of magnitude increase in the debris that is out there. How do you start to write those two very different timelines and rates of change?
It's almost as if you've seen these slides in advance.
Almost.
So before I'll answer the policy question in a second, but just to touch on a few technology and system solutions. Again, material science, so improve material science to eliminate the chance of outgassing, fragmentations, possibly even on-orbit manufacturing so that everything is put together already in space, so you don't have to worry about the atmosphere versus vacuum issue. Sustainable designs and end-of-life technologies, building into the satellite system some sort of option to deorbit it and bring it back down safely and cleanly without the potential of creating additional debris. Active debris removal and on-orbit servicing. I touched on this in my talk yesterday. So actually sending up autonomous aircraft to clean up some of the debris, bring down some of the larger satellites, or even to reuse satellites, refuel them, and reduce the need for additional launches and by extension additional debris. All right, so yeah, that's what I was just talking about. So policy solutions. So the UN actually just released long-term sustainability guidelines where they call on all spacefaring nations and space actors in general to build some of those technology solutions that I just discussed into future mission planning. Key to what George mentioned earlier, they specifically put language in there to build these sustainability design practices regardless of size. So even into the small loaf-of-bread CubeSats, which are now being launched or being planned to launch in mega constellations, so we're talking hundreds, potentially even thousands of small satellites going up at once, building in those end-of-life requirements so that there is always a plan to bring it out of the debris field once it's no longer operational, and so that it's always trackable and always can be incorporated into overall space situational awareness, which kind of gets into my last bullet there. I kind of always equate it to air traffic control on Earth. You can't go into the air, it depends on the country, but in the United States, you can't go into the air without being a part of the air traffic control system. You need to be registered, you need to be on the communications bands, you need to announce, intentions, you need to announce approach. None of that exists in the space world. There's pockets of it, and it's kind of segmented, but there's no integrated awareness among all space actors that can be used as one system to avoid collisions. A good friend of mine, Dr. Whedon, he said if you're operating in a satellite in space, it's like having a GPS in your car, but all the windows are blacked out. You know where you are, but you don't know where the other cars are. So imagine trying to navigate on a highway in a situation like that. That's the main challenge in sustainability policy, is taking these guidelines, even though they've already been created and suggested on an international level, taking those guidelines and actually implementing them into national policies, into commercial regulations, and creating a framework across all space users and space stakeholders, to increase that awareness. So this last video is actually a simulation of the single satellite collision that I just mentioned in 2009. It was actually an Iridium satellite, so sat phones, if you've been deployed, you know the Iridium sat phones. So they always have numerous satellites in polar orbits, as you see there, kind of like a basketball. So one of those collided with a defunct Russian military satellite in 2009. There was no real warning that was issued, just because at the time the data, it's funny because the DoD had been providing Iridium with almost daily collision warnings for like 2 years straight. But the data was never really valid, There was really no value to, reacting to any of them. They were pretty much dismissed. So literally about 2 months before this occasion, or before this incident happened, they stopped issuing the warnings. Not that Iridium would have done anything anyway, even if they got the warning, but the collision happened. So they kind of hit each other at almost at a right angle, a relative speed of about 22,000 miles per hour, and created about 2,000 to 3,000 trackable pieces of debris, and of course countless other non-trackable ones. And therein lies the problem. Again, it's a huge policy challenge, but the intent is to create that sort of, universal awareness of where everything is, so that you can avoid this, cut down on the proliferation of debris objects that are in space, and then once that's in place, start cleaning it up.
Yeah, so that's a problem, and that's a problem that is also then now converging with commercial endeavors. It's now converging with, again, if you think in terms of great powers, of many different nations, be it the European Space Agency, Japan, India, that list is continuing to grow. So this problem is getting more difficult. And then, Josh, one of the things you talked about, is just the initial engineering challenges and difficulty of getting, just leaving Earth, then potentially an additional challenge in engineering feats that are going to be required to go even beyond low Earth orbit and from there. I know you have a couple of images. As a former Army officer, I always enjoy pictures. So
Yeah, it prevents
share with
me
us
from
that.
having to sound intelligent. So is it next?
This entire weekend is imposter phenomenon for me.
So you've probably heard about this rocket in the news, and it doesn't get a lot of good press because it's had its hardships as far as the project goes, but this is our space launch system. This is the United States heavy lift capability to get things into space. What do I mean by heavy lift? We're talking payload fairings up to 10 meters, and what that means is you can get big pieces of equipment that are really heavy up into space, and you can get them to the speeds needed to go to the moon and to Mars. Right now, there isn't a heavy lift capability that exists on this scale. Closest thing would be probably the Falcon Heavy, but even then, it's different project. This is a human-rated heavy lift rocket, and the challenges of creating something that's human-rated are pretty intense. If you look at comparison with a payload rocket and something that's flying humans, the requirements that we've got to levy on it as a NASA standpoint are a little more in-depth than what you could expect if you're just flying payload. If you have an issue with your rocket and it fails during ascent, no one dies. It's not that big of a deal. Customer might be mad if you blow up their payload, but at the end of the day, it's not so much a safety issue. When you develop something that's a heavy lift rocket and it's human rated, the challenges are a lot greater because of the risk. No one wants to lose astronauts. Every time we do, projects are grounded. Apollo 1 was a 2-year turnaround. I believe Challenger and Columbia were both 2-year turnarounds after the tragedies. So I want to talk a little bit about what SLS is and try and kind of dispel some of the myths and what it takes to get something that's this big and why it's important. So these are some of the configurations that you can see with SLS. The idea is they were going to develop a Block 1 version, and that was kind of the stepping stone into this Block 2 or Block 1B setup. So what does that mean to you guys? Well, we've got to make a heavy lift rocket, and we've got to make it safe for humans. So it's expensive, and it's a NASA project because there's no commercial market for flying humans to Mars yet. There will be one day, but right now, there's just no way for a company to sustain that kind of R&D. It's really cost intensive, and the daily cash burn rate is pretty intense. So the idea was we'll start out with SLS, and we'll do a Block 1 version, which has the only difference is the second stage is adapted from an old Delta IV configuration, and the Block 1B and 2 versions have a organic second stage rocket that is intended for SLS. So when you get these rockets and you're like, wow, they're billions of dollars, and why are we doing this? It's really to kind of do something that industry just can't support right now. There's not a company out there that's going to build a Saturn V rocket. I mean, they're going to try, but they can't just say, hey, we're such and such space company and we want to build heavy lift rockets. We're going to have to do something else to kind of sustain our business model. And this is why a government project like SLS matters, because we're the only ones that can do it. And traditionally, governments are the ones that kind of lead the way with R&D, and then they kind of hand that over to the civilian or commercial sector. With that being said, these are Boeing products. But it's a contract where NASA engineers are doing a lot of the design and development, and Boeing is working with NASA to create these products and build them. And it shouldn't say just Boeing. I mean, there's companies like Honeywell. There's all kinds of flight computers on there that are built by different vendors, but these are the configurations we had. You spend a lot of money up front, but the second configuration was supposed to be a little cheaper. So we'll go to our next slide. Just to give you some scope, you can look at those pictures, but a lot of times when you build big rockets, it's kind of easy to look at a photo and you really don't understand like what you're actually doing. If you look at this, I believe this is the hydrogen tank for the RS-25 motors, which are old shuttle motors. But if you look at the people there, if I asked a group of you guys or girls, hey, go build me that, how long is it going to take you? I mean, it's just the engineering stuff is very immense. And then so I say, go build me this, and now I want this kind of test on it to prove it's safe to fly. So it just kind of gives you an idea on like the magnitude and the size of these projects. I mean, you can imagine all the stuff just to move the components costs a lot of money. So when we hear about, we're spending billions of dollars on a heavy lift rocket, well, heavy lift rockets cost billions of dollars. There's just no way to get around it. You're like, whoa, I bought my Toyota Tacoma for like 35 grand, and that thing's got all kinds of technology. Well, they built like 5 million Toyota Tacomas. There's only one heavy lift rocket facility, and everything that goes into making the rocket costs money too. It's not just, okay, well, we built this rocket. You have to build things to test the rocket. You've got to build things to move the rocket, to fuel the rocket, to store the rocket, and all those capabilities cost money. So here's just trying to kill you guys with photos here. I can talk some more on this, but over beers it'd be easier. This kind of just shows you, okay, so we've got a heavy lift rocket, and the SLS it's a liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen rocket, so its byproduct is H2O. And it's got 4 shuttle motors, the RS-25s, and then it's got a 5-segment solid rocket booster, 2 of them configuration. The only differences between the solid rocket boosters you saw in shuttle and these is that they're 5 segments and not 4. Well, why does that matter? Well, when you add 25% more booster, there's 25% more problems that come with it. Temperatures increase, structural loads increase. It's called impulse, which is how long your rocket burns for us. That increases, and those are challenges that you've got to engineer out. And you've also got to do this in light of its human space flight. If this was flying cargo payloads, the requirements aren't as intense, but as we're flying humans, you start adding these capabilities, it just gets a lot more difficult. To give you an idea of like what the cargo payloads would look like, SLS has got ginormous fairings. And that's important because if you're going to go to Mars, you're going to go to the moon, we've got to get big pieces of equipment up there. And while with shuttle, we had a decent payload fairing size and about 50,000 pounds roughly of payload capacity, SLS is just trumping that because it's well over, I think it's 140,000 pounds in a Block 1 configuration. Pardon me. And this is all hard, right? Like 8 meters doesn't sound like a lot, but I mean, that's roughly 24 feet. Build me a fairing that can withstand, 3,000 mile an hour speeds and, the heaviest part of our atmosphere, and tell me how long it takes you. And then, I'm going to make sure you're doing all this other stuff because it's got to be human rated. When you're engineering these things and you hear about it in the news, what I would kind of hope to portray to you guys and girls is it's hard and it's expensive. while we do have some poor management on the mission side as far as awarding the vendors with maybe too much of performance when they're falling behind, there's a lot of things that you have to develop and create that they're just unknown. And if you're doing something for the first time, you're always going to run into problems you couldn't foresee. Apollo 1 came from, that accident was because they were in an oxygen-rich environment in a capsule, and we just happened to have a fire. And no one had the foresight to say, okay, well, what are the fire ignition sources within this kind of environment? And we ended up losing 3 astronauts on the pad. So this is why these things take so long, and that's why they're hard. Here's just talking about the boosters. If you guys are done reading, I can go to the next one. Here's just looking at the core stage. So this is where all the magic happens. This core stage is pretty powerful stuff. What's cool is they're reusing RS-25 motors from the shuttle that have actually flown. The only difference is we're not going to return these motors anymore, so they won't be used again. So it's kind of like a sad story. Hey, you did good work for us. You flew 3 missions, but now you're going to end up in some sort of deorbit plan where it'll not be space debris for too long. And there's another picture of the core stage. So this test stand is actually putting compression on the core stage. So when I talked about, hey, build me something and then test it. So what they're going to do is that's pretty much a giant vise. And so, hey, build me this rocket, but I need you to test it. And you're like, well, okay, Josh, I've got to build a giant vise now. Give me more money. It just gets very, very expensive. And if you can look, if I say, hey, build me a vise that can compress something that's hundreds of feet tall and weighs, thousands of tons. And these are some of the challenges that we're looking at. Here's some more talk on the actual motors themselves, and what's pretty cool is they're talking about like the serial number and what the engine had actually done. We get a lot of, or I hear a lot of talk out there like NASA doesn't do things like reusable like you're seeing at Spacex or some of the other companies that want to land boosters. And I would make the argument they have. If you looked at shuttle, one component out of the configuration wasn't reusable, and that was the fuel tank. But the boosters were, landed in the Atlantic under parachute, and the shuttle would land and it would get serviced. So, if 3 out of the 4 components, weren't reused. But when you think about reusing something and you're thinking about what NASA's intentions are, you wouldn't so much want to, you're going to have to make a compromise on your payload abilities. If you've got a large amount of payload you're trying to get up into space, and you're trying to land your booster or land your spacecraft, you've got to have structure and fuel that's in those spacecraft or in the boosters themselves that actually allow for that. So NASA doesn't, in this project, isn't going to land anything because it's like, all right, well, we're building this heavy lift capability, which is entirely essential to go to the moon and Mars. Okay, now I want you to land it. Well, you're sacrificing payload, and that whole point was like getting heavy things up into space, at a high enough velocity where they can actually go to a lunar or a Martian orbit. So here's the shuttle motors, the RS-25. It's pretty cool. I get bored sometimes, and I'll nerd out and watch YouTube videos of this thing firing. I don't know why I like it so much.
Now, Josh, I actually, it is pretty cool, right? So I have a question though, right? Because you're describing these really significant engineering challenges, right? And those engineering challenges have different objectives, even if it's one of reusability, obviously some aspects of efficiency, obviously aspects of safety whenever you're talking about things that are rated for human flight. But the destinations probably obviously also matter as well, right? You mentioned that to go to the moon and Mars is one of the driving factors that creates these immense sizes and capabilities that you're attempting to do. Why the moon and Mars? Why? How do they relate? What gives them the overarching importance of what we're doing?
Well, and you guys probably heard about a conversation with a scientist I had, and they were talking about going to Mars, and someone had on the panel had made a comment about a 30-year plan that when Bush announced it in the early 2000s. You can't fly 8 months, generally speaking, depending on mission length on the surface of Mars. But you can't fly 8 months one way and survive and then come back if you can't fly 3 days one way and survive and come back. The technology readiness levels on a lot of the stuff that you're going to have to create to get to Mars, you need a proving ground for. The moon's a really great place to test all that stuff because it's close, right? So you've got the safety factor with astronauts. It's pretty representative of, the things that you need to do, i.e. get something heavy that can fly humans for a long period of time into space and get it far enough away where it's not a low Earth orbit launch, and then also land there, survive, do stuff, make a sandcastle, whatever they intend on doing when they get there in 2024 or 2028, and then come back. And the hardest part is coming back. You can go somewhere and land, and we're pretty good at doing that. We've got a ton of rovers, but if you want to go somewhere and come back, that's where the real engineering challenge is how do I land there and come back off of the surface. So with the moon, it's a little easier because the gravity is about 1/4 of what we have here on Earth. With Mars, it's pretty close to what our gravity is, and it's a proving ground. And I've had many, graybeards we'd call them in NASA say, if you're not able to do this stuff and prove it out, there's such a safety factor of, that you're going to take on because you just have all these unknowns. No one thought the water, I've told the story before, like the water reclaimer on a space station breaks all the time. Why is it doing it? Well, when they urinate into the water reclaimer, they're leaching calcium from their bodies because it's a microgravity environment. No one knew about that. That thing was built, tested, went through, all the gambits of becoming something certified to fly on the International Space Station. Yet, but when you get up there, why is this piece of crap breaking? Well, no one knew. And those are kind of the unknowns that you've got to prove on the moon before you could fly to Mars.
That's fair. Now, if it be like these changing dynamics of different rates of slow policy change, rapid, change in terms of that immediate environment, the engineering challenges that are there, George, where does this, the commercial aspect of things sort of fit into this?
Yeah, so we're really, I think, on the dawn of a new era. NASA and the DoD and other agencies are partnering with commercial industry in ways that they have not before, and we're realizing some really exciting accomplishments at a pace that is frankly hasn't been seen since the Apollo era. Mm-hmm. Just a picture up here is the SpaceX's crewed demo mission. It was a Capsule Dragon version 2.0, which is a human-rated capsule docking with the International Space Station. This happened just earlier this year, a few months ago. This was a very different arrangement. People, what is commercial space? To Josh's description of SLS, that's we're still working with a contractor, right? Boeing in the case of SLS and SpaceX's case, we're still a company. A key difference is with these commercial contracts, when the government goes out, they're buying a capability. They're not prescribing. They say when a requirement is let, this is what I want to do. They don't specify to the nth degree, this is how you're going to do it. And that's really, I think, probably one of the most straightforward explanations of the difference between commercial and more traditional acquisitions of space hardware. That gives companies a tremendous amount of freedom and leeway, opens up the trade space, I think, enables tremendous innovation, but in partnership. NASA, nobody launches humans into space or has more knowledge about launching these wet, soft payloads that need air and are very needy in many cases. Nobody knows how to do that better than these guys. And so the wealth of experience and the knowledge that they bring is indispensable. But when you compare that, I think, with maybe a little different risk tolerance, with the pace of innovation that is enabled through the commercial industry, I think you can see some really exciting advances, and I think that this is just one of many examples. But I guess just that, if there's one key takeaway here, I think, you hear about the new space race. It could be government versus commercial. It could be commercial against commercial, SpaceX versus Blue Origin. I really think that it's important to replace in that narrative the versus with a with. These challenges that we're going to probably expand on a little bit more in the rest of our talk are incredibly challenging, to say the least. Going to the moon, going to Mars. The picture that we had, of the lunar landing. achievements that will remain iconic, for generations. At least I hope they do. And it's not going to be done alone. Jeff Bezos might be able to, but who wants to be single, right? So, I think it's going to be in partnership. I think it's going to be in partnership between industry, between government, bringing, frankly, the best minds to bear, the best capabilities to bear to achieve some really inspiring and, amazing accomplishments going forward.
It's interesting. It could have been prompted. I just took a quick look at some of the audience questions. It could have been prompted by the statement that you just made, George. But the first question is this notion of does the potential future space exploration, could it potentially lead to more unity, or really sort of more competition and division along those lines? And I think if you want to comment further on that, but I think that the changing of the prepositions is key, right? That notion of width that is there. What are some of the practical sort of near-term steps, say like in the next 5 years, that could then potentially set conditions for the next 50 to really have that partnership and collaboration be at the forefront of things?
So I think Drew has already taken a stab at a lot of answering that question. So I think while there's great technological innovation, there's room for great policy innovation, frankly. So establishing the rules of the road, the air traffic control system, what are the norms that companies and countries need to conform to operate in this environment, at least responsibly, is incredibly important. Beyond that, the partnerships I think are critical. There's been historically no better time to be a space entrepreneur. It's still really, really, really hard, as Josh explained. But the government is going out and investing in startups, and an example would be in the DoD. There are little incubators. I'm an Air Force reservist, so a little pitch to my home unit, the Defense Innovation Unit. They have a space portfolio, and they're going out in the Valley, in Boston, and Austin, and other cities around the country where they have this really rich innovation culture, and they're making these seed investments. So I think that's creating, a really solid foundation, and from there, companies are able to go out and raise, private capital for every, dollar of government investment. You can raise many multiples of that out in the private market, and it really starts to become a virtuous cycle. And furthermore, we're starting to see both government and commercial companies build infrastructure. And I got to tip my hat actually to Blue Origin. Jeff Bezos has made it a stated goal for that company to kind of lay the foundation and put the infrastructure in place to enable really a healthy ecosystem of companies that can go out and start building commercial businesses and pursuing enterprise and exploring. So I think it's a pretty exciting time.
That's neat, sure.
Could I chime in on that? So,
Yes.
Is the question up there?
Yeah.
So the question actually asks about globalization and unity, and I think it's important to kind of define and stratify exactly what those mean. So there's the norm building, right? There's space actors agreeing on what safe, sustainable activities in space are going to look like, and that's fine. That's an agreement that needs to happen. But in terms of unity, we've had Americans and Russians working together in space since even before the Cold War was over. There's been several instances where, despite the geopolitical climate that's on the surface, we still work hand in hand in cooperation with other countries in the name of science. On the ISS and elsewhere. Actually, the first foot that was on the moon wasn't a human foot, but it was the lander's feet, and that was actually manufactured by Canada. So Canada actually had the first feet on the moon, and they made the arm on the space station. They made the arm on the ISS, and then we asked them, what do you want to contribute to the Lunar Gateway? And they're like, we'll make another arm. So Canada's all about the space appendages. I think going to the moon is going to provide some unity. I think going to Mars is definitely going to be an international effort, and it's going to provide some unity. I worry that once space becomes a little bit more militarized, once there are resources to compete for, humans don't really have a good track record of unity when those situations evolve. I think it's going to be a good, now this is the futurist in me, I think it's going to be a good measure of our maturity as a race, how we continue to function as a global unit once we start making those moves outside of the Earth. So.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting this historically, like the European countries in the early modern era, they're leaving the Middle Ages and they become seafaring nations, right? And that brings with it positive and some catastrophic consequences that come to it. So then I think it's a fascinating question just to think, for beers later, what happens when you become a spacefaring nation, right? What are the biological implications along those lines? Another scholar is working on a grant. Emily is here, in terms of what happens, when something gets introduced to Mars, right? I mean, I think that's probably a pretty important question that I know a lot of human beings would have probably benefited from, sometime after 1492, if the technology and the intent was there. But keeping your futurist hat on, just sort of rapid fire, and you've sort of already touched upon this, Drew, and one of the questions that came in from Eric with a K was, if we think back 50 years and we're on the moon, today an American astronaut is leaving from Kazakhstan on a space mission on a Russian
Soyuz,
craft, on a
Russian
Soyuz
rocket.
craft. Again, still in some cases you could say 1970s technology with that.
Very much so.
Right. Next 50 years, what's coming? We'll start with Josh, then George, and then come back around.
There's a gentleman who's working on a CubeSat project now where they're actually trying to make an anti-gravity drive. Sounds crazy, but you can check him out on YouTube. I forget the gentleman's name, but it's something they're trying to field. I think in the next 50 years, you'll probably see different propulsion techniques. We've kind of perfected chemical propulsion. So I think in the future for spaceflight, you'll probably see different approaches, be it ionizing xenon atoms and using that kind of solar electric propulsion, or if this guy's anti-gravity machine plays out, which would be cool, solve a lot of problems. But I think that's what you'll find in the next 50 years.
I'm reluctant to, frankly, predict more than a couple of years at any given time, to be honest with you. Frankly, just over the last decade, I would not have predicted where things would be where they are today. I'm very optimistic and excited about the next decade, and really optimistic about the next 50. I will say, while there have been some amazing achievements over the last 50, I'm going to be really bummed if we see another play out of frankly the last 50 years, and 50 years from now. Mm-hmm. I have pretty high expectations for humanity, for our generation to go out into the solar system, maybe beyond. Gotta work on that gravity drive, but yeah, I'm hoping that people are out exploring, that spacefaring nations and individuals is a common place, and while we'll always I think hold the first footsteps on the moon as really being a treasured achievement, it's now immersed in cooperation and governments and companies going out and developing and growing, creating value.
Yeah, well, we have a couple minutes left, and another interesting question came in. It's talking about the Tillman Scholars Space Force, right? That it's growing. Right. Lance, I think, is in the audience. I think he just got picked up for the Pathways program as well. Is that cool? Is that correct? Emily, you're working on as an assistant researcher on a grant. Kellyanne as well. Johnny Kim at the Johnson Space Center, and Kim Young. We were attempting to pipe her in via video teleconference from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which the distance between here and California appeared to be too far, which after thinking about the distance between here to the moon or Mars, I feel like an imposter. But as the Tillman Scholar Space Force grows, what are other opportunities for the scholar community to interact in terms of just as you think of it, be it from a business perspective, an engineering perspective, a policy perspective? What are some of your thoughts on there?
So I kind of touched on this yesterday. One of the things I hold a passion for is advocating for making space technology more available for humanitarian purposes, for international development, for disaster relief, particularly for NGOs. The cost of access to space currently it's still astronomical. I mean, SpaceX is doing a great job at driving costs down, but I mean, it's still, you know, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars to get operational imagery satellites into space, let alone, you know, continue to operate them. So right now, if any NGO needs space support for any reason whatsoever, obviously they don't have their own satellites up there. They rely on the charity of commercial operators, some governments, but commercial operators. Those are good business practices, and I would like to explore taking those business practices that currently exist with a few of the operators and finding out how to, you know, make them more sustainable for other businesses to assist, maybe even incentivize them at the policy level. There are frameworks in place on the international stage. It's called the UN Spider program, where spacefaring governments share services with other UN partners, you know, and for disaster relief and things like that. But again, that kind of exists only at the government level, and not necessarily for the smaller agencies that may need, you know, they may need imagery for refugee tracking. They may need to assess climate impacts, you know, in developing countries, and you know that imagery costs. To make that more available, if you're operating in space, chances are you already have, you know, a pretty decent fiscal situation. Your portfolio is looking pretty good. The real good on the ground that a lot of space technology provides is in that NGO realm, and you know, making that more accessible is something I think the Tillman community could probably collectively charge forward on.
Okay. Yeah. We're going to go a little bit rapid fire. Space Force, thoughts? 5 seconds or less.
I'll let these two guys go, and then I'll come back to me.
Space Force?
Yeah.
It's cool. I want to join it. Like,
George, Space Force, reaction.
I think it's time. Yeah, I've come to that conclusion as well. I was skeptical as well, being an Air Force member. I hate to see my service potentially have this schism develop, but I do think that when you have a problem and the potential for problems to emerge, it is a unique domain that I do believe deserves its own attention. Maybe like a Space Corps is probably where I fall out.
That's a good segue to my position. So
Yeah.
I feel that we already have a sufficient response structure for anything that could happen militarily with any of our space assets. I don't see the need for a space warfighting force. What would their basic training even look like? Like all of the, no, it sounds fun, but really all of the other branches, their intent is to employ violence on something, right? I mean, you go through some sort of basic combat training with the intent that if World War III kicked off the day that you graduated, you could pick up a rifle and fight.
right, but I would kind of steer away from that. The Space Force, you should look at it more. So if anyone remembers Panama, and how all these missions came from all these special operations units. You had, SEALs swimming across the canal, planting bombs on boats. You had Rangers taking the airfield. You had so many, chefs with their spoon in the soup pot that it really kind of got out of hand, and that's what kind of created SOCOM. I think is how the story goes. Like after that, they're like, oh my gosh, there's a ton of capabilities, all of these assets, how do we manage it? For me, Space Force is kind of the natural progression of, a theater that's super relevant. If you looked at, there was the Army Air Corps, and then kind of after World War II, turned into the Air Force. And I believe it's just becoming so big that you're gonna need that. And I don't think it's a bad thing. Like contrary to what probably a lot of people think, DoD spending drives innovation. Provides jobs, drives technology, it makes those technologies cheaper. So to me, Space Force is a great thing. And maybe it's 10 years too early or maybe it's 10 years too late, but I don't see it as something as purely let me, there's that warfighting function, which hopefully they sign me up for. But it's also like managing assets in space, you know,
Sure.
kind of like the Air Force and the Navy manages assets, you know.
But I would argue that we already do that in most functions. I mean, there probably is a benefit to a reorganization, like George said, maybe in the Space Corps. But I mean, the Army Air Corps had already proven its military worth in battle. I mean, there was a proof of military value for air superiority, and it had already existed. There was already war doctrine in place. None of that exists for any sort of space branch, whatever it ends up being.
Well, no. Like,
And this is potentially a debate we might have to
Yeah.
This is a peer
continue
debate.
forward. And actually, George, I want to go back to you actually for sort of some closing thoughts, actually, in terms of if there's any sort of potential call to action. And it goes back to a comment you made earlier about that notion of width, and in terms of the aspects of the partnerships. Again, as you look to the future, what do you think are some of the primary things that everyone should sort of take away and really then also look for as indicators that notion of width and partnership moving forward? What are the indicators we should seek to ensure that positive collaboration is going to be occurring?
First of all, I think finding organizations that are really out there that are willing to take on the risk and push the envelope, and so make sure that there's a healthy ecosystem of those, paired with organizations that are still accountable, maintaining good practices, and making sure that the system is still the underlying system is strong. So I think seeing those two healthy mixture of the two is certainly important. But at the end of the day, I think having if I'd say the call to action would be a get her done spirit. It's got to be performance. It's got to be achievement driven, and it's got to have a vision. We got to know where we're going. And it's essential that there are people out there that are every day getting up and driving toward that vision in the long term.
George, as we sort of leave from this, I very much appreciate the fact that would you just describe something as both aspirational and practical together? And I think, and it sort of goes back, I think, to the question that was posed about the Tillman Scholar Space Force that's there. But I think it's pretty remarkable that we've been able to have a conversation within this community, a community that in some ways there's the moniker of that Tillman Scholars get shit done, right? And they do so with a degree of optimism that is true and a degree of practicality that is true to the legacy that's there. So to the three of y'all, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you, in some ways of some mind-blowing math, which I generally refuse to refrain from participating in public, and the challenges that are there. But I think more than anything, I greatly appreciate the spirit of this conversation that, again, is both simultaneously aspirational as well as practical. And I think that'll be a really interesting theme to carry forward in here in just a couple hours when we'll actually be able to listen to David Epstein in the arguments that he's making, again, in a relation to the context of this community of things of, again, what a generalist approach, again, with enough expertise to really talk intelligently about something, but again, how we could particularly thrive. But again, thank each of y'all for what y'all are able to offer here. And again, thank you for some great questions, and we'll get ready to transition here shortly as well.
Say something. If anyone wants to debate the moon landing tonight, please seek me out.
See you at the bar.
Yeah.
I'd love to take that talk offline.
Fair enough. But tonight, again, a round of applause for our panelists.